Thanks so much for joining this session. It is a real pleasure to chair this. And I decided in the bathroom earlier that I would also take this opportunity to embarrass Kirsteen just a little. Kirsteen and I both did our PhDs at the University of Glasgow. Kirsteen finished probably just about a year ahead of myself. And she was always an inspiration during that time. And her methodology from her PhD thesis was also a great inspiration for the methodology for my own and how to write up method. And since that time, the wonder of social media has allowed me to, at least from afar, follow Kirsteen's career and really just admire and respect the way that she has combined her activism, her union work, and her scholarship together in a way that these are not separate identities. These are identities which the whole person embodies, I think, in everything that Kirsteen does. So it really is a pleasure to be able to stand here today and chair this session about this wonderful book that she has written. For those of you who don't know, our author that we are meeting today is Kirsteen Paton, and she is a senior lecturer in the sociology of class at the University of Glasgow. And her research explores issues of class and the impacts of urban restructuring, gentrification, evictions, and large-scale sporting events on working-class communities. And she's written 2 books. The first was Gentrification, or Working Class Perspective, and the second is Class in Everyday Life, which is the book that we're here to discuss today. And it's also my great pleasure, yes, for those of you who might not be aware, it's also my great pleasure to introduce 2 discussants for this morning. The first is Dr. Abigail O'Connor, furthest away from me, who is an urban sociologist based in Liverpool, and her research primarily focuses on the financialisation of land and housing, the role of the local state within these processes, and the impact on the political economy. And through her PhD fieldwork, the misplaced representation of coherent class politics and political ideologies in Liverpool emerged as a key factor in the rise of the far-right corruption in local politics and the complacency of the left. So all very relevant topics to the current juncture that we find ourselves in. And I'd also like to introduce Dr. Emma Jackson, who is an urban sociologist working on the practices of place, urban multiculture, class belonging and the city. Until this summer, she was a reader in sociology and director of the Centre for Urban and Community Research at Goldsmiths. And she is the author of Young Homeless People and Urban Space, Fixed in Mobility, and the co-author of Go Home, The Politics of Immigration Controversies, as well as many other things. There's a very long biography here. So the book that we are here to discuss today, Class in Everyday Life, presents in-depth studies of housing, sport, art, music and politics in Britain, and persuasively demonstrates the pervasive influence of class on everyday life and the need to recenter a radical understanding of class within emancipatory political movements. The book makes the case for a sociology of class, which is informed by a politics of class based upon using the everyday as the point of inquiry. So the way that we're going to structure this session this morning is that Kirsteen is going to speak for about 12 minutes, just giving us, and I will time it, giving her reflections on this book that she has written. Then Abby and Emma are going to engage with their reflections on the book. And then we will open for discussion, but as I kind of mentioned or gave clues to in the earlier plenary, we're going to be doing this discussion in a slightly non-traditional way. So normally after a presentation, particularly of this kind, people are very keen to discuss and interact. But with so many of us in the room, it's often quite limiting in the kind of the traditional format in which we do it. So instead, what we're going to do is to allow you first to break into little groups of 2, 3, 4, more if you like, to speak with your neighbours around your reactions to what you've heard here from the platform this morning, to discuss your initial thoughts and reflections. And we'll do that for maybe about 10 minutes or so. And in that time, we're also going to ask you to peer review the questions that you might want to ask with our speakers. And the reason that we're doing this is not to kind of gatekeep what questions we might get at the platform, but it really is to kind of build a kind of productive discussion. So what we want you to do is to check, is it really a question that you're asking rather than a comment? We all know that we're bad for that, right? That people also avoid delivering their own paper from the floor. Again, I think that's something we've all experienced. and see to question whether this is something for the whole room to discuss, or maybe it's something you could follow up separately with the author or with the discussants, who I'm sure would be more than delighted to speak with you. So we're hoping what this does is actually open up the space for dialogue rather than closing it down, which is maybe sometimes what the traditional format can do. So with that, it's my pleasure to hand over to Kirsteen for her 12 minutes. Oh, are those?
Does this? Yep, this one works. Thank you very much for that unexpected introduction. But I am really glad you mentioned our time at Glasgow together, because we have this kind of wider network, and I'm really networked with the discussants here today, and I hope we can pull that out in the talk. I did want to start by saying that because you're in this room, that means that you haven't gone to Kirsty Russell's session, Freedom to Run. And I wanted to promote that session for you today. So Freedom to Run, if you don't know about that, is a film that Kirsty was involved in making, and it's about running and runners in the West Bank and the freedom to run. She's going to talk about filmmaking. Freedom to Run Film at gmail.com is how you can contact Kirsty Russell, and she can talk to you about arranging screenings of that film. It's a really excellent resource for teaching as well. So Freedom to Run, I've also got social media accounts, so you should look that up. Thank you for letting me speak about this book today. Thanks to the Sociological Review and my discussants for being here. Rather than try and give you a synopsis about this book, because that wouldn't work, I'm going to place it in the context of race riots this summer in Britain, said to be led by a left-behind, disenfranchised white working class that were harbouring legitimate anger. And I want to provide a short commentary on that as a way of thinking about where sociological debates on class currently are, and to also situate what my aims in this book also are. And if you permit me, I'll transgress the bounds of an author meets critic format, although I'm not really sure exactly what that format is, to ask a question to the room, because it feels really important here, given the introduction that we had this morning about undisciplining, about public sociology. And also, I think this question is really urgent too, and that is, what is the sociology of class for? Who is it for? And what should a public sociology of class also look like? And I hope that we can kind of discuss that throughout the session. Because who the working class are was the subject of hot contestation in response to the riots over the summer. The white working class became this stand-in for all working class, presented in these different ways as either victims of austerity and decline, as being ontologically racist, or being rose-tinted, the other way is completely unracist, or, as we might have seen on social media, described in really vile terms, in terms of people's clothes, in terms of their teeth, in terms of their body, this kind of bodily, kind of disgusting kind of commentary that emerged. Satnam Virdi describes the white working class as a subject that are summoned. And the white working class were summoned and defined and needed, as needed politically, to divide, to inflame and control, just as migrants were summoned in a different way and by definition not working class. And what's been lacking throughout the debates was an expression of class in a much more expansive way, rather than a narrow way, as Satnam would put it, a recognition of the multi-ethnic working class, along too with a recognition of the political capacity, potential for mobilisation and solidarity amongst working classes. Because this notion of the white working class, it's got a much longer history of use that I can't get into today, but it has really proliferated over the last decade. And largely, I don't think it's been confronted by class academics. And this is definitely in part due to a few things. I think it's to do with a historically poor attention to race, politics, and histories within the sociology of class, and a preoccupation with cultural and relational and descriptive approaches to class. And I'm saying that not to lay blame here, but I think we have to recognise the context. There's been undoubtedly a trend towards Bourdieusian analysis in British and European class research. And that offers a really powerful repertoire to articulate cultural class inequalities and their embodiments and their injuries. But amongst other things, I think the focus that gives on differentiation, on class differentiation within that analysis starts to place this premium on between kind of intra-class boundaries between the working class and the middle classes, rather than looking at these kind of wider political forces and forces of class formation as well. But the limitation of class research has much deeper roots, beyond that trajectory. The study of class has never really been that radical. It's been much more conservative endeavour, and I think Bev Skeggs conceives it well when she notes the roots of class analysis. They lie in two strands, two areas, one of critique and one of classification, and that first strand of critique is a more Marxist approach, which differs very radically from a classification approach, which is based or has its roots in extracting value from the population created by the government to serve the government. And I think what's been lacking amidst these trajectories are approaches to class which take the politics of class seriously. And what I mean by that, I don't think necessarily would fall into that category of critique. I think it's something more than that, and it relates to the formation of class within a current conjuncture, how it gets made and remade within particular contexts. And Imogen Tyler diagnosed that we have both a poor sociology of class and a poor politics of class within that, and I think that that's a really important claim. I think it's the political content of sociological analysis of class that's been lacking. And then what happens is that when we have this summoning of class, of the white working class, we have these narratives that get to kind of proliferate and serve these political ends. So we can see them in the pathologising of the working class as being feckless, lazy and immoral, which was used to justify what's a longer trope, but it was really activated to justify public sector and welfare state cuts born of austerity. To then this presentation of the working class as being victims with racist views that need to be understood and heard, and all constructed as a constituency to help shift to the right in political ideology. I think I saw Aaron in the room. I think that his work is really important in this, in clarifying the role of political elites in promoting and normalising right-wing ideology, rather than it being that drive from below. And Robbie Shilliam notes that the white working class has never been a self-authored constituency, I quote, but is, at least in good part, an artefact of political domination. And I think this manifests today clearly in this left behind ideology. But what's significant is that brilliant analysis, which enabled lots of academics to challenge that ideology by political media classes around skivers and benefit frauds around austerity, I didn't see it being extended to this presentation of the white working class as being exclusive victims of austerity and disinvestment and left behind, by class scholars at least. And yet both of these representations of the working class, not self-authored, are ideological, they're exclusionary, they're divisive, and they're politically strategic. And what this all, for me, really underlines is how desperately we need more expansive and political understandings of class. And my book was an attempt to try and respond to that. And it's also an attempt to move away from a sociology of class which is solely focused on inequalities and injuries. And that is not to say they're not important. I think testifying to the violence of class is absolutely vital. And a brilliant colleague of mine, Jenny McCartney, has recently done this work on showing that how austerity means people are now dying younger in Britain, which is a reversal of the consistent improvement of mortality rates for the past 200 years. So the violence there is clear, and more violence yet to come in a Labour extension of the two-child benefit system, of the ending of the winter fuel allowance. So more on the way. But if we exclusively tell these tales of violence and social damage rather than class mobilisation and organising, I think we present a weak version of class. purely as an artefact of political domination, to quote Robbie Shilliam, rather than have the capacity to resist such domination. And I was struck always about how much historical sociology attempts to capture this and does it really, really well. Plotting the points and connection points and complexities of class formation, who comprises the working class. I think we see this brilliantly in the work of Satnam Virdi, also in the work of Leila Dalasheh on multi-ethnic Palestinian solidarity movement. She looks at how that was fighting both British colonialism and Zionism, but also a conservative Palestinian political class. And also the work of Mwandesi and Titelman, whose longue durée approach to class struggle in the United States shows how that it's on sites of social reproduction where class recomposition takes place and where you can see these coalitions forming. They say that it's on these sites that the working class begin to articulate themselves into a broader class unity. And they argue that social reproduction is the primary site for that at one of the most militant moments in American history. I quote them, "It was in the neighbourhoods, apartment buildings, parks, schools and streets that the working class made itself into a political subject." So in other words, class is formed in the everyday, and it's not that the sociology of class doesn't look at everyday life, but it doesn't hold that it's the site where the class political subject gets formed. And it lacks a commitment to capturing those in the present. Instead, we're leaving it to the work of historians to do that. And I want to try and capture that as it happens, as a kind of live sociology. And for me, that became a really important agenda to try and build within the sociology of class, to explore that within contemporary culture, so that when we have these narratives that begin to come out politically and in the media, we have a counter version that we know that exists as well, that coexists. We have the points of resistance and solidarity. We can show a wider conception of working class that's not limited to this narrow understanding of identity or authenticity or characterised by differentiation, but something that's much more diverse and multi-ethnic. And what's vital to understanding class today is an engagement with these kind of processes that have entrenched class decomposition, and maybe 3 minutes, and allowed for a amount of recomposition and that kind of emergence. That's what, to borrow from kind of Raymond Williams, would say as that kind of point of emergence, or to use Stuart Hall's language, to see how class is made and remade in the current conjuncture. That's what I was really interested in, that, and this focus of remaking and unmaking class in the conjunctural moment, I think, is really central to the book. And I look at different sites to do that. I look at music, I look at art, I look at sports, not only in the streets and fighting fascism, although looking at sports this weekend, I was in Glasgow city centre, and it was the white working class group that were being kettled in the city centre in a protest against the far right. It was not the far right in that group, it was Celtic football supporters that were anti-fascist. There were white working class that were being kettled by the police in town at the weekend. And these are kind of different things I tried to draw from the book, and also draw from different voices. I'm so glad to have Emma and Abby here today, because their work's been really important in different ways. Emma's work that pulls out issues of gender, that urban and multiculture, draws from place and Sunderland, and Abby's too on urban political economy, colonial histories, stigma, and draws out issues of class identity in Liverpool as well. And I hope we can pull out their work in the discussion. And I will end now by saying this is just, I think, the beginning of a research agenda for me, like personally. I think that there's so much work still to be done to offer a sociology of class that still goes beyond description and classification, or of individuals and communities. And it's about taking a different starting point, a different premise for me, and that's firstly a recognition of the politics of class, mobilisation, organisation, solidarities first, and secondly, a class sociology as a public sociology which seeks to act as an intervention, not only to cut through some of those debates that are referenced here today, but also to empower the communities that we're talking about, especially after decades of disempowering, of the cutting back and undermining of the labour movement, where a lot of those educations would take place, a cutting of community education resources as well. For me, this raises really serious questions about a public sociology and what we mean by that, especially when it comes to the discussions around class as well, and how we might think about how our sociology can be a public sociology that informs a kind of critical popular education. So I'm really glad to be here to talk about the book, but I'm hoping as well in the discussion at this conference on this theme, that might be also something that we could draw out in the room. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsteen. It's a real pleasure to be here today and to speak about this book, available in all good bookshops, that I've been excited to read for a long time. It's a book that's taken a long time to write, and while this is in part due to, as Kirsteen says very explicitly from the beginning of the book, about the conditions of the production of the book, some of the most challenging years in UK higher education, in which Kirsteen has played a big role, you know, as a union activist, and that also takes time away from other things. So it's not entirely on purpose, I don't think, that this book took a long time to write, but I think it's also a book that's benefited from a long genesis. Class and Everyday Life is both a heavyweight intervention into the sociology of class. It feels like a heavyweight piece. It's not that long, but it's a heavyweight contribution. But it is also a massively refreshing read in an era where both mainstream discourse on class has become hugely reductive and academic discussions have also become stuck, harmfully so, as Kirsteen has argued in the book and in her introduction. Because Kirsteen didn't do it, I'm going to give you a quick scoot through the form of the book and then zoom in on the question of class, race and politics that Kirsteen opened with. So the book begins with Kirsteen setting out the stall of her intervention into studies of class and her use of conjunctural analysis inspired by a Gramscian approach as developed by Stuart Hall that seeks to explore the relationship between political, economic, ideological and cultural change. Key to her analysis are the material and political aspects of class that she argues have been under-theorised in recent years by scholars of class in the UK. In order to do better, Kirsteen develops what she calls rhizomatic thinking, paying attention to how class is attended to in areas beyond class studies, including feminist, critical race studies, art history. It's a nice bit of undisciplining. Recommend. This gives the book its refreshing feel and breaks us out of some of the tired debates about class. After this, there are 4 thematic chapters on class and space, class and sport, class and art, and class and music. To give you a bit of a flavour of what this productively expansive perspective looks like, the chapter on class and sport takes this subject and then follows the changing contours of the finances of football, the English Premier League, and rising ticket prices, but alongside accounts from working class fans about their relationship to spaces of football, and an analysis of how the authentocratic moves of the political elite have led to the framing of the England football team, the multi-ethnic England football team, taking the knee as somehow elitist. You know, how can all this happen? The other aspect that I wanted to comment on as part of giving an overview, which is present in this chapter and throughout the book, is the relationship between teaching and research, which is so lovingly shown and carefully rendered here through the inclusion of students' voices rather than incorporation. Sticking with the sports chapter, one account that's really stuck with me is from Charlotte Holmes, reflecting back on her time as a young aspiring athlete hampered by a pair of old trainers. And she's talking about going to compete when she knows her trainers aren't up to the job. She says, "I remember it so vividly. My mum comes belting into the sports park, she was a runner in her day too, with a pair of new runner shoes for me to compete in. She'd managed to pull the money together to buy me them, and I'd never felt so lucky." But she goes on to reflect, "I never really stood a chance. We couldn't afford the basics, let alone travel and all the rest of it. And my club itself was totally under-resourced with too many members for the trainers and coaches. Yes, you need talent, but talent doesn't rise to the top. You need a ladder." So Charlotte's account contains her own analysis of her class position, which Kirsteen then develops in relation to Ballant's idea of cruel optimism and also the wider context of the inequities of lottery funding and who gets paid in sport. So I love this way of working with the students' accounts and the students' own interpretations that you then add to and develop. And much lip service is paid to research-led teaching, but when we're doing it right, we also end up doing teaching-led research. And I think this is a wonderful example of how that relationship works and can be used to think about writing sociology in more imaginative and polyvocal ways. I also want to comment on the book's breadth. And what distinguishes the book for me is the range of subject that the focus of everyday life allows for. So Kirsteen's well known for writing on class and space and cities, but this is really expansive. So each chapter gives us this clear-eyed and forensic analysis on these subjects. But for me, there's immense value in looking across all of these chapters together for an in-the-round view of how austerity, the slashing of the welfare state provision, and the increasing role of the market in all aspects of life have regressively impacted working class people, while also prompting forms of creativity and resistance through housing campaigns and through cultural forms. So I want to now return to the current context that Kirsteen set out in her introduction. A recurring theme throughout the book is what is lost through that formulation, that closed formulation of the white working class, almost all one word. It's been salient, to say the least, reading the book after the recent far-right riots across parts of northern England and the Midlands, including my own hometown of Sunderland. And one of the points that jumped off the page at me was this critique that Kirsteen's restated today, that class scholars have not extended the same level of critical attention to constructions of the white working class as the ultimate victims of the current moment that they did to critiques of the unproductive skiver that proliferated in the early periods of austerity. So to explore this a bit further and to jump off from the book's contribution, I want to turn to a couple of stories from Sunderland. So the first story is this. 5 minutes. Whew, quick stories. In the summer of 2011, I was approached by a TV production company to meet the artist Grayson Perry to be interviewed for a programme about class and taste. I don't know if you remember it. It was called In the Best Possible Taste. I'd been recommended to the producer as a sociologist working on class who was from Sunderland. The producer arranged for me to meet Grayson Perry in a cafe. There were lacy net curtains hanging in the windows, heavy wooden tables, and it was quite dark inside. There aren't actually many cafes like that in Sunderland at all, and no one knew where it was. When I was asking people where it was, no one knew. But I think it was chosen as representing their idea of an authentic working class space. Perry had been spending time with a group of working class white women who had dressed him up to take him out on a night out. He showed me photos, and I think what I was supposed to do as the expert was to verify that, yes, this garb was an authentic working class outfit. I felt quite uncomfortable at the idea that there was one working class aesthetic in Sunderland and that this could then be used to speak to a national level, because this was about class in Britain. I asked him about what this traditional working class would look like if they had chosen, say, Leicester to film the programme in. And I also drew on some of Anoop Nayak's work about the North East, deindustrialisation and consumption. Needless to say, I didn't make the final cut. I'm not bringing this up just to air my grievances about not being on the telly, but rather because this narrow focus about what working class life might look like is hugely challenged by this book. And Sunderland it wasn't an accident that they ended up there. It was attractive for the same reasons that made Sunderland the poster child for Brexit and later in discussions of the Red Wall working class, because there's a version of this place that lends itself well to the narrative of the white, left-behind working class, and then this can be used at a national scale. It is a predominantly white city, but it's also got a small but long-standing Bengali community. It's also been the location for many years for the dispersal of asylum seekers, and the expansion of the university has changed its ethnic and national makeup massively. So my second Sunderland story, a quick one, is that in the immediate aftermath of the riots, in a powerful interview for the BBC, Zaf Iqbal, a Sunderland taxi driver, described his experiences. And I'll quote him. "It is very frightening because you've got a mob attacking a building which is a place of worship, just the same as a church or a gurdwara or a Hindu temple. It is a building for worship. I've lived my life here. I'm proud of the fact that I'm a Mackem. I'm proud that I'm English. I was born and raised and lived all my life in Sunderland. Today I don't feel safe. Sunderland's my life. I go to the matches. I've got a season ticket. I sit there in amongst the crowd. Why shouldn't I feel safe on the streets I was born and lived all my life in? Kirsteen's book predates these events, of course, but they serve as further evidence for the points made by her and others that defining the white working class as the poster child victims of austerity and of migration at the expense of a more expansive lens is both inaccurate and damaging. Rather, Kirsteen's book allows us to think with the story that Zaf Iqbal hints at here in his everyday life of work, his sense of place, his participation and enjoyment at the Stadium of Light, but crucially, the forces outside of his account that shape that experience.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Firstly, yeah, it's an absolute honour to be here today. I just wanted to start by thinking about, I think often when we think about academia, and particularly as a young person who's recently finished their PhD and left academia after years of spending time on the picket lines fighting, as I know many of us in this room have done today, I also think it's epitomised by the fact that this is a full circle moment for me, because Kirsteen was my undergraduate supervisor, who I have learnt from and been inspired by and loved for many years. She taught me how to be an actually sound trade unionist, which is sometimes difficult in this country, and what it was to be a sociologist that really cared about their community, and so much more. I've seen how much work's gone into this book and Kirsteen's teaching and her organising, and I knew when I read the first draft of this book and chapters just how important it would be to us, both as a discipline, but also to organisers on the ground, and I hope we can draw more of that out today. In a different tone to Emma and Kirsteen's introduction, I think what I wanted to take as a jumping off point was to explore the real value of the framework that Kirsteen's developed is and how it can move our sociological imaginations forward. And I'm going to do this in relation to place, space and organising, as that's my background. So the very short version of this, for those of you that don't know, obviously we've spoken about Liverpool. Liverpool is a city in the northwest of England. It's where we've both lived, worked and loved. And there's also a common sense narrative of Liverpool as a city framed in public, political, academic discourses, that it represents a socialist utopia, that it's a space in which working class solidarity flows throughout the very bricks that are laid on the ground of the city. It has a strong trade union history that contributes to this, and it's had and shown a willingness to stand up against the state, both in the face of Thatcher's managed decline and in the lies that were spread after the Hillsborough disaster that took 97 innocent lives. It's also a place that has had a consistent vote for the Labour Party, historically, not now, the left-wing party in this country. And all of this has led to this sense of Scouse exceptionalism, which is deeply rooted in an idea of working class solidarity and what it is to be working class. And part of this as well was tied to a lot of things that Kirsteen explores in the book around the Brexit vote being lesser in Liverpool. It doesn't have any right-wing politicians. When the national anthem comes on in Liverpool football games, the fans boo it because they see themselves as Scouse, not English. They see England as a space which is inherently elitist, as a space which doesn't treat them as real people, and as a space, as it's narrated, that doesn't take seriously working class lives. But when you scratch the surface of Liverpool, what you see is a city that's much more complex, and the framework that Kirsteen's work develops really ties into that. It's not one that can be flattened as a homogenous space that's just socialist. It's one that's been impacted in multiple ways by different social, political and cultural crises, or junctures as Kirsteen talks about it, and so does Stuart Hall. And what's happened in Liverpool is this has culminated in a working class identity that's both imagined and understood, both from the outside and within, as inherently white and inherently exclusionary, which sits in contradiction to the very idea that Liverpool is this welcoming and socialist city that loves everyone and is built on migration. So what we see then is if we look at Liverpool and we think about how Kirsteen does in thinking about histories that are absolutely essential to the present and how we need to trace them back but not focus on them solely, how we need to look at what they're doing in everyday life now, is to see that actually people in Liverpool, as an example, don't vote against the left wing, or don't talk about solidarities because they believe in that ideology. They talk about it because that's what they have come to see be what working class is in the city, and it's incredibly narrow. And this isn't to say that Liverpool doesn't have good anti-racist, anti-fascist organisers. We do, we know many of them. But it's to say that this representation of people and place as a narrow understanding of working class has created massive complacency. And we saw that when the far right came to see us in August and started tearing up a mosque, and we had to board up an asylum link centre. And for those of us on the ground, we knew it was coming. It wasn't a surprise to us. But this representation of Liverpool as a space that's inherently working class, without actually understanding that being working class isn't one specific thing. It's not the white imagined working class that it is in Liverpool. We've seen other aspects of this that have had huge impacts. Corruption in the local state is a massive aftermath of this idea of Liverpool's representation. The Labour Party have held, and Kirsteen's work explores some of this in the book, have held a huge stronghold in the city that have meant that they've been able to use housing as a mechanism for corruption and disenfranchised a huge swathe of the very deprived populations, of which the far right, we see, those of us that organise on the ground and do the research, have come in quietly but surely to explain to the left behind working classes in Liverpool that actually it's the elitist left wing and it's the organisers and it's the anti-fascists that are the problem, and it's the migrants that are with them. And I think what's worth thinking about here as well, because what for me has always been the vitality of the way that Kirsteen thinks and writes, is, as I said, is both about the histories, but their salience to the present, but it's also about the way that her work draws on the scholars like Doreen Massey and others who connect the local to the global. And the fact that everything that is experienced globally is felt deeply locally. You talk in the book about Airbnb, gentrification, corporate landlords, financialization. 5 minutes, crikey, it goes quick, doesn't it? And that we need to understand that, like, despite everything that I've just explained about Liverpool's history, using Liverpool as an example, and it's the same in Glasgow, yes, it makes it an anomaly to other cities, but it's a city that's built on the transatlantic slave trade, and these histories are woven into every aspect of the city, into the trade unions, into the buildings, into the jobs. They're all inextricably tied to colonialism, and it complicates the city's imagined white identity. And until we take and move forward a sociology of class in the way that Kirsteen does, we're never going to be able to understand those inherent tensions that exist within these cities, and we will continue to see race pitted against class, as Kirsteen talks about in the book. Okay, I've only got 5 minutes, so I'll move on to talk about, is it fine? Oh, don't say that, I'll be here for half an hour. I guess one of the other things I think that's really important in this book that your work always talks about is an understanding of the fact that we need to move beyond class that's privileges and identity politics over and above economic inequality and exploitation, in the same way that paid labour has long been privileged over social reproduction and produced a narrow framing of class. And one example that I think is really useful, that I know we've spoken about loads, is when you come across individuals, and this has happened, I'll speak from my own work in Liverpool, who are ostensibly working class and would be considered, perhaps in a Bourdieusian world, to have quite clear traditional working class markers in where they live, the jobs that they have, who they vote for, whether they're involved in trade unions. But it becomes apparent when you take the lens of space, which you do in the third chapter, and look at housing and how housing is now an asset that's commodified. A lot of these people are own buy-to-let properties now, right? So you have this real contradiction and tension between people that still see themselves as ostensibly working class because of perhaps the trade they do or the place they came from or where they grew up, and now actually are people that are overseeing exploitation for their own financial benefit, described by them as, in many ways, I'm sure all of us have heard it, as social mobility or entrepreneurial or whatever it is. And I think that particularly the conjunctural analysis, but also the everyday lens that you use, really cuts to the heart of this issue, and of the tension that I think all of us see when we organise and are asking, particularly in tenants' unions, who are our material allies? Where does that lie? Is it the students that are living in gentrified housing but are also being exploited by the landlord, or is it the people that lived on an estate, now own a house, but actually then rent out another? And that tension is really apparent throughout all of your work, and it's something that I think, I've said this to you before and you'll say no, but the movements across, but particularly in housing, would benefit from reading this and understanding the way that you think through this. I guess then just finally, another point that is really clear, and you mentioned it in your introduction, is what is community now and in relation to class. We know obviously class has shifted and solidarity, you know, as it's often narrated, has eroded, but we know it still exists. And you talk about this in the book in terms of the Home Office violence in Pollokshield in Glasgow a few years ago. And as you mentioned, we saw it recently in the far-right attacks. You know, the reactions when we were blocking up the walls of Asylum Link because we knew that the Fash were coming, or in any cities, you know, it wasn't just in Liverpool, that wasn't spontaneous, that has its roots. And I think often, particularly those of us that work on the ground, are really easy to say, that doesn't exist anymore, it's been eroded and we're so divided. It does exist, we just have to look for it and we have to organise. And the way that you frame it in the book really beautifully is around hope and a politics of hope and what class solidarity is and how we lean into that, and how without continuing that and finding those glimmers of hope, we're never going to move forward. And I think it's really tough when you're in the trenches to see that, because that division exists everywhere. And really importantly, what you talk about is a multi-ethnic understanding of class, which has to exist. Tenants' unions doing deportation resistances is an absolutely beautiful example of that. You know, I remember when we first did one of ours in Liverpool, someone said to me, but you just resist landlords, you don't resist the Home Office, what is that? And I think your book really brings together why those processes are inextricably intertwined. And I guess my very final point is just to say that if you haven't read this book yet, when you read it, you will see the very generous and generative nature, which is very much reflective of your scholarship and you as a person and a friend, but also reflective of the need to centre a politics of care in how we understand class and community and solidarity. And I think particularly in HE and in any sphere under neoliberalism, it's really easy to let care go first. And you know, that's not good for any of us. And I think that this approach is the one that we need to take forward to understand all aspects of research, teaching and organising. That's why it's such a vital book. And to understand that, you know, the everyday is and always will be our collective expertise. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the very disciplined speakers at Undisciplining. Very much so. So before we hand over to the kind of wider discussion, I would like to invite each of you to kind of pose one question to Kirsteen to respond to. I don't know who would like to go first.
Okay. All right. I kind of, this isn't maybe a very good opening up question though. I want to know what you're going to do next. Or how should this work? How do you see it being taken forward and built on? Yeah.
Okay, and I'll take them.
Do you want mine now?
Yeah.
Okay. Mine is kind of connected to where we ended there, which is around, you make the case for a renewed politics of hope, as we said, being essential to our collective class analysis. I want to know if and how have you seen hope articulated in recent months? And if so, what did it look like? And then how, this is like 17 questions, how can we take it forward? So have you seen hope in the way that you talk about in the book? And if so, how do we take that forward?
Okay. Firstly, thank you to both of you for your contributions, and it's so interesting to hear your book kind of through other people's lenses like that. I really, really appreciate it, and it made me feel a little bit more hopeful, like hearing it back than I often feel. I think hope's a really funny thing to think about, and I think I could do a lot more than I did in the book to kind of scratch deeper into what I mean by that. You know, I used the famous Raymond Williams quote in the book in the early chapters: "To be truly radical is to make hope possible than despair convincing," which I think is really really important quote, and has been a lot of inspiration. But what I think is really critical in that quote is the making hope. It's the act, it's the craft. So what I see as hopeful aren't these inspirational points, and I think really good, you touched upon it, Abby. So let's think of the example of Kenmure Street that we all, people might take that as this real
flashpoint of hope and inspiration where you saw hundreds and hundreds of residents come out in Glasgow to defend to residents from deportation from the Home Office. And that's a really beautiful moment. I'm absolutely not denying that it was a beautiful moment, but it's what goes behind that. And I've got colleagues that have written on this. Ashley Mullen and Teresa Piancentini have written about that. It wasn't just that day. It didn't just start there. That was about so much work, daily work, invisible work for years and years and years, and organising and sharing strategies. And that's the thing where you talk about like making hope. It's actually not the points that you see. It's about the kind of getting up all the time to do the thing when you actually maybe aren't feeling very hopeful about that. It's like what kind of makes it work. And I think that that's really incredibly important and doesn't get seen. And I think that there's also something within that too about, again, I feel like I'm kind of being a broken record, is that's just not part of a sociology of class, is ever recording that kind of work, which for me seems like such a core aspect of what class is. It would fall under other categories, right? It would be research on social movements, because I think a lot of class organising can fall under that theme. I think geographers do better at looking at this type of work, but we haven't really done it. And if we do, it tends to be more maybe labour movements. Even labour movement scholars, they're in business schools. Like it's not within the sociology of class. So I do think like capturing that kind of work is really important. And of course, that work as well is very gendered. It's very racialised as well. And I know that you've written about that as well, Abby. So it's not without problems either. But I think that that's very important. The things that you don't see. And then the what next question. I feel like this then becomes like I have a plug for a panel later on today, which I'm speaking. So Kirsteen is in the room, who I've been working with for a couple of years now, and I think it relates to just exactly what we have been talking about. And Les asked me this question actually on the train on the way down. We had a cup of tea and a cake. He said, "What are you doing next after the book?" And so, as Emma mentioned, if you don't know, like my research has been, like over the years, has been on cities, urban processes, housing struggles, and that's continued throughout while I've been working on this book. And as I was saying to Les last night, when Emma and I interviewed Les and Nirmal for the anniversary of Live Methods. And we've got a special issue coming out in Sociological Review. But you said in that the sociologists, and I'm using this later, so you're going to hear me say it again, sociologists are tremendously good at critiquing, but not so good at making and creating, and that really has stuck with me, and particularly when we're thinking about a sociology of class and what that might look like. How do we go beyond critiquing something? How do we make something? And so for the past year, I've been working with Kirsteen and Joey Simons and Kate Wilson, who we hope are en route from Glasgow because the trains have been very bad today. We've been working on this archive for Glasgow housing struggles, and we're building an archive as a community resource and thinking about how we can activate that. And that might not ostensibly look like class sociology, but for me that is a kind of class sociology, and thinking about how you can make something and then what you do with that thing that you make. So we're talking about that project later for Excellent today, if you want to hear more about that. So, yeah.
Great, thank you. So as I signalled at the beginning of this session, what we're now going to do is get you to speak to one another. So those who are at the back might want to join another table so that they can make new friends or get acquainted with old friends.
Might actually kill it. They could be talking about me.
So we've got one here.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for this incredible panel, and congratulations on the book. I think everyone here at the table who hasn't read it, already put it on our reading list. I would like to share an extensively peer-reviewed question that has emerged from our... No, not anonymous, no, but it has emerged from our conversation, because I had to teach a class earlier today, and we were reading a 1914 text by Rosa Luxemburg that is titled The Proletarian Woman. And I asked the students, who is the proletarian woman in that particular text? And we, here at this table, we started talking about what this question encompasses, and we thought it would be a good question to ask you, Kirsteen, who is the proletarian woman in your book?
Okay. Okay. Does anyone have an even bigger question than that? Any more hands? Oh, there's one here.
See, we actually had two, so I'm trying to see if I can merge them together. Both we discussed how you felt in terms of your own positionality, because very often in discussions of class and working within class, it touches people very kind of emotionally about their own journey and the aspects of insider-outsider research. Would be interesting to hear your position about. And if we are allowed, just a little bit more on some of the specific methodologies, about the everyday life. Like, so how did you work within kind of the sports, the music, what aspects, and how did you tackle some of the specifics about the methodologies? So sorry, that's two.
That's fine. We can do a 2-for-1 offer there on the question. But Kirsteen, do you want to respond now?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. I feel like I need longer on that. The question, who the proletarian is in this book, to answer it, because that is like a key question in the book that probably doesn't give the definitive answer, because it's not seeking to give an answer in because that's the problem, as I'm saying, with class analysis, is seeking to define in overly analytical or descriptive terms what class is. But I think your question is more than what working class is, and it's like who the proletarian is, and what that kind of version of class looks like. And they're the key questions that it's definitely been put to the reader, and which that I'm trying to explore in the book from two perspectives, definitely as a sociologist, but also from a kind of left-wing perspective, and as an activist, they're definitely at the forefront of my mind. And the key answer, the broadest answer, which is that it's homogenous. I feel like that's such a cop-out, but I think what we've kind of pulled out in these discussions is how vital it is to have these complex understandings of class that are not defined solely by labour, that are not defined solely by race, that are not defined solely by gender, and having this much more kind of complex idea of what class is and how it's formed, and the locations and where it's formed says something about class formation, in the everyday, in apartments, in parks, in neighbourhoods, in communities. And I think that that's really vital, is understanding how that political subject is being made and remade. And that should be very challenging in terms of what class looks like, because I think we get so caught up, particularly a particularly British kind of phenomenon of what class looks like. And I think which Emma illustrated really well in her example, that what class looks like, the identity of class. And unfortunately, that is not just a common sense understanding. That has penetrated sociology when we go too much towards the cultural understandings of class and notions of what's authentically working class. That starts to come through in the way that people use Bourdieusian analysis that I've found. Anyway, this is class, this is working class, this is not. An example recently was Angela Rayner about being criticised for dancing, and she's like, I'm working class, I dance. I'm like, oh, because ontologically the working class love to dance. Like, there's just a really kind of odd thing to say, but it brought up, and then I was reading this, then I was reading the Twitter thread where someone had said in relation to this, we have such a bad grip on understanding class in this country in relation to that. And I thought, yes, I'll bookmark this. I will read the thread. And then I was reading the thread. The original post was being challenged by someone in the comments, and they're like, no, you're wrong, class is about that. Class isn't just about economics, but it's about identity. And I was like, oh, here we go. And then I'm reading it. And then it said, I should know, I've studied class. I'm a sociology student. I wrote my dissertation on it. I thought, oh, great. Like, what are we doing? Like, if this is like where we're going with this. So it's about getting away from those kind of cultural ideas and thinking about how the working class subject is being formed in relation to new class inequalities and mobilisation, consciousness, and growing that consciousness about what class is, and I think there's a lot of work to do with that. So that is a really long question, and I don't, answer to your question, which was so succinct, and I think that's actually something I'd like to kind of come back to, because I think it's a great way to pose that question. So I'll come back to that too at a later point, because it is great. How do I feel with my own positionality in writing the book? I mean, because I've been working with working class communities for many years, I think that's something that I've always thought about. And I think when you're doing, and this is going to relate to your second part of your question as well, those experiences about positionality, you're confronted with more directly when you're undertaking research processes which are one-to-one or are interviews and things, which I've done in the past when I did research in Partick. And I wrote about that within that, because even though I'm from a working class town in Scotland, which is similar composition to Partick that I was researching, you're a PhD student at Glasgow University. You're coming down to do research, so you're definitely both in and out of those communities. So that's something I've always thought about in the research. But lately as well, there's a lot of debates about, and it comes back to this question about how we understand class. That's not just simply about identity. There's a lot of debates about what is a working class academic, and what's the working class academic experience. And I find them really, really interesting in the context of the sector, our working conditions. But those questions about what our working class academic experiences aren't often about those. They're about being an outsider in the academy. And I don't feel that those are the pressing questions about what is a working class academic. I feel working class academics about precarity and about your conditions at work, rather than that kind of identity of class. I feel like that stuff really gets missed when you talk about that. So when I was writing the book, because I wasn't directly interviewing people as part of that, although, and I'll get onto this with methodology, I was talking to my students about class that were from very different class backgrounds. I did have that kind of in my mind about that kind of sense of positionality in those debates, because I think that academics commit the same sins as media discourses and political discourses often do as well. So yeah, I think it's kind of getting beyond that. And the methodology in the book is using the everyday as a methodology, and that meant a lot of things. Draws a lot from Les's work and Nirmal's work on a live sociology and thinking more creatively about sociology, as well as drawing from how we research everyday life in and around us. It was also a kind of reaction to being able to do research, the economy of that in our institutions. So it's a piece of research that's not born out of a research project. So it was not me going and interviewing people. It was not this designed a big kind of research project like that. It was different kind of systematic way, but rambling way of accumulating and building case studies from different pieces of research that I was involved with in different cities and different spaces on the one hand, But two, the book actually is born out of teaching. It kind of goes the other way, as Emma alluded to. I was teaching this course on class and everyday life. And the questions that I've raised, I was posing to students to say, what does class look like? How should we study it? How should we understand it? And each week, students were asked to write about their own experience of class and whatever that topic was that week. So music, sport, art, space, politics. And they would write them as blogs, and then we would discuss them in class. And a lot of them are reproduced and used in the books as these really fantastic sociological analysis on class. The better book would have been me just publishing all the students' vignettes of, like, they were just so like wonderful. Like, there's one where I think it's my favourite is a student, Laura, when I ask about art, and students never wanted to talk about art, and the blog would always begin, I don't know anything about art, and I don't know anything about art because Bourdieu says I don't have the cultural capital to know anything about art, and it would go like, that's how they would start. So Laura tells this story about this school trip that they go on in year 9 to Paris, and they go to the Louvre, and there's the Mona Lisa, and our friends are looking at it, and one of our friends responds, it's a bit naff, really. And like Laura's like, and she, imagine saying this about the Mona Lisa, and it's because she doesn't know, because she doesn't have the cultural capital, because we're working class, and she brought it into the seminar to discuss, and I went, no, Laura, maybe the Mona Lisa is naff. Like, maybe it's like an over kind of produced, kind of touristic, kind of, can we, talk about those aspects of it? So it was a really great way to unpack things with students, for them to kind of analyse their own class position. And that became so inspiring to me to write the book and to use those kind of insights throughout it. So that's the methodology that's used in the book. It's like it's part kind of a case study and part this way of bringing in student voices, but reacting to current events as they arise in the conjuncture. That's why it was very hard to draw a line. We were just talking about it in writing the book, because it was during such tumultuous times, something else would happen, and you think, I've got to write about this, and it's chronic, and it would, you couldn't stop. We've just seen again this like riots in the summer, and it just goes on and on. So that is a very challenging type of when you're working in the present day like that. But that was the approach.
I think what I'll do is I'll ask for some more questions, and I'll maybe give you an opportunity at the end to kind of summarise your own thoughts around the variety of questions that we've hopefully been asked. Okay, so we've got a hand here and another hand there.
Hello, we got a non-peer-reviewed question.
Oh,
sorry for that. Yeah, we, as early career researchers, we feel curious about your publication process, how you get published this work and targeted the publisher and got peer-reviewed or whatever. And yeah, I think we also related to some questions about the publishers, right?
Yeah, so just to follow Alex's comment, as Alex asked that question, I said, well, yeah, and it's interesting to see it published by Routledge, because, it sits outside of the sort of Verso, Pluto press, so we're interested in where you published, but also the process. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. There was another hand just behind there.
Thanks. I think this was informally peer-reviewed. We didn't come up with a solid question, so I'm kind of picking elements out. But first I want to say congratulations on the book, and thank you for that. I think, am I too close?
That's good.
I don't have a lot of concert experience. I think it's really important at this point in time, where we have a really reductive, both racially and politically, construction of the working class, conservative or right-wing or reactionary one, that in all three talks, you're bringing out sort of the nuances, the tensions, the sort of the silent sort of points of activism, engagement, and diversity of the working class. But I think the the reductive one sells, and I think it even sells for some sociologists of class, who I think should be better at critiquing narratives. But I guess the question we have is, how do you draw out these nuances, these more progressive stories, to challenge that reductive narrative in a way that manages to still capture the tensions and nuances without sacrificing them? Because you don't want a sort of like a purely kind of like the mobilized, the Liverpool as left-wing mobilization kind of narrative that I think was really well sort of examined. How do you do that?
Okay. Any further questions? Because I suspect this might be our last round. So here's a hand here.
Are you sure? And mine's really quick. It was just following on from where you left off there, Kirsteen, and about where you draw the line. And just in terms of the contents page of your book, you cover space, sport, art, and things like that. And I was wondering, if you were to write a second edition, or what would you add in terms of categories?
Okay. We already had that discussion on the platform that she has to do a second edition, so she's now fully tasked by this room to do that. Any burning questions, peer-reviewed or not? I think you had one. Yeah, please.
Hi, thank you. I think it kind of follows on from the previous question, really, which was, thank you for the talks, and it looks like a fascinating book, and looking forward to reading it. I suppose it's really just about class as an identity. Maybe that's kind of implied in some of the other questions as well. So we can think of class as a form of analysis, but also the ways in which people do or don't kind of embrace, I'm this or that class or not. And it feels like what you're arguing for is for people to have more consciousness of class and how it unites or divides us without necessarily naming themselves or identifying with a particular class identity, because that can create sort of problematic forms of exclusion in different ways. And I just wondered if that would be the right reading of what you're saying, having not even read the book yet. But anyway, thank you.
Well, hopefully, based on this discussion, you're definitely going to go away and read the book. Any last hands? I just want to make sure that everyone who does want to ask a question, we've got one here. Sorry, Karen, you're getting your steps in.
I just wondered if you could spend a minute or so talking about self-authoring, which seems like one of the possibilities when you said, for the white working class or the class authors to be their own voice. I wanted to unpick that a bit and ask you what you think that looks like.
Okay. All right. I think what I'm going to do is... Yes, sorry.
So I just wanted to add to that by asking what that would look like, and also ways in which perhaps newer technologies or different technologies could be used, like social media and Instagram, and what that would look like.
Okay, thank you. So that the pressure doesn't all rest on Kirsteen, I'm also going to allow our discussants to come in, since they have closely engaged with the book and will have their own thoughts and responses. Not to obviously answer all of the questions, but maybe just to pick out some of the key points that you might want to contribute to, and to give you slightly longer to get your thoughts together.
Just a couple. Yeah. No. I might do some summarising for you, and it gives you longer to think about. There's a couple of different categories of question that I think we're getting, and one of these is about the nuts and bolts of the production of this book. So from your own positionality and how that's influenced the writing, which she does one, like, you don't do. It's more implicit than explicit at the beginning of the book, but there are some wonderful vignettes woven in around, for example, your experience working at, is it Rico's? Yes. Rico's, the nightclub in your own hometown, and the sort of pseudo oasis like bands that are playing and around class and music and stuff. So there's some great reflections where Kirsteen is also very much in the scene. But I'm hearing some questions about how was it made, how did it happen, what methodologies, what are the nuts and bolts of production, how does a book happen, how did you publish it with Routledge, which I can't answer, but they must be pleased with it because it's straight into paperback, which is really unusual, and therefore not costing £100, I would imagine, so that's good. And then, that question about why does the reductive formulation of working classness sell, and how to draw out more progressive stories without either over-romanticising, which can, it can happen when we dwell just on the Kenmure Street moment. And again, that came out of, as you said, all this behind the scenes work of building those networks in Glasgow in response to terrible violence against an asylum seeker in the city when asylum seekers were being dispersed to Glasgow. So there's this, as you say, this massive complex story. And how to draw out these stories, I don't think a good answer to do that, apart from to say that I think that's a really important part of the work, and it's always the challenge to not paint people in one dimensions. Either way, actually. But maybe Abby wants to come in on that.
I do want to comment on that, actually. When the question was asked, I sat here and I thought, I can either answer this as an activist or someone that's involved in academic research, and there lies the problem. The fact that was immediately the space that I went to speaks volumes, I think, to the problem that we've had, both in the academy and in activist circles, in the sense that we all know about the power dimensions that are there. We also know that, I've seen this from afar because I've left higher education, but the pressures to publish, to pump out articles, to get the data and then leave will always inherently be there. So I guess that's a personal question that we ask ourselves. Personally, I've spent more time being an activist than an academic, so therefore wasn't in a position to get a postdoc. That was a personal decision I made, but it had consequences for my life and security, although security in academia doesn't exist, we know. I would say that one thing I would say is that engagement and genuine engagement, actually spending time in a community, not just because you're there to understand what the tensions are, just because you're there to muck in. And Kirsteen was, I keep calling you KP. Kirsteen was talking about the invisible labor that goes behind stuff. And I was talking the other day about this as someone that, a lot of people don't understand that those rallies that you see have hours of scouting and planning and completely invisible labor that go into it. And you will never understand that unless you spend time in a community. You'll also never understand both ends, not to romanticize what it is to be working class or not. So I guess engaging, and from an academic perspective, and this will probably make me be unpopular in the room, it would with some of our Borgesian friends, but to let go of some of the very, very strong existing class frameworks and to embrace kind of the messiness of not relying on that, because times have changed in terms of the political economy and the pernicious hold that the far right particularly have in online spaces, particularly with young people. And they've changed since those frameworks were useful. And I think that would be one thing. Very last thing was, because Kirsteen will not say it, because I know you'll be humble, is I think the questions here have shown that the breadth of this book in pushing boundaries, theoretically, conceptually, and methodologically. And I think that's something that I just want everyone to take away if you haven't read it.
Okay, you now have the task, of 3 minutes.
Okay, so I actually think that kind of almost your question about the self-authoring is connected to your question. And if I understand what you were asking there, I'm not saying that people should be involved in those things and then not subscribe to seeing themselves as working class. I think that it's about having a better understanding of what working class is, that are beyond whether that's stereotyped or identity-based or cultural-based kind of understandings of that. And it's maybe more community-based. It's about understanding power. It's about understanding exploitation. It's about understanding those shared experiences of those and having an identity, or identifying with that, I think, and being conscious of that. And And the issue of kind of how do you self-author that, I think, I mean, so this is the crux of it, really. It's how do we improve also that becomes, it's not just simply about self-authoring, because many people will give bad views of class based on media and political narratives around class. So it's not about self-authoring, borrowing from narratives that have been kind of drummed in to us. It's actually more for me about that more kind of popular education on class and understanding class, having better understandings of class, sharing those, and those understandings of class being about those shared experiences and community experiences. I'm more interested in that rather than people kind of self-authoring class, because that becomes... That does become kind of, we're repeating those types of issues. And that's not to say people aren't reflexive and know about class, but I think we can quite quickly, when, I found it as well, when people, that question with positionality, I'm like really careful not to start talking about like class in terms of like my own kind of like conceptions of class, because that's a really kind of common question. People like talking about class in those terms. I'm from here and this and that, and these symbolic indicators that we use. And it's about trying to move away from those. For me, that's about what I'm trying to explore. And I think that technology can be really, really important with that in multiple ways, in terms of allowing different understandings of class, literacy on class to circulate. If we even think about what we're talking about later with a digital community archive that's a free community resource, then technology is really important there in terms of providing that opportunity to share knowledge that can empower communities but disrupt other narratives around class as well. But also as well, like social media, as we know, it's not kind of one way. It can be used in other ways for people to challenge their own way that they might have been portrayed in class, or get other kind of narratives out there as well. And how do you draw out the progressive stories and the balance? I feel like when you're working within local communities and you're working within your neighbourhood and when you're working within the groups, I think it's really easy because I see both faces of it, like clearly like the uglier side and the more hopeful side, and so you see those a lot. But I do see like it's the organising that I don't see that I'm trying to bring to the fore, and I'm very what I guess I'm conscious of doing is I'm trying to balance the scales on the other side for now by presenting the things that I don't think that people do see, but without suggesting that all of these other things like don't exist. And you do have to hold both at the same time, but I think the book is more in trying to bring the kind of scales up to the other side, if that makes sense. And yeah, the publishing. As Emma said, I took a long time to write this book, where there was 3 editors that were in place, and when I turned up with a finished book, they didn't know who I was. So they didn't know. And the book changed along the way. One thing that I will say, to answer that from a kind of ECR perspective, was that when I was trying to publish my first book based on my PhD, that was a nightmare, in terms of trying to publish that, because it was based in Glasgow, and publishers did not want to publish a Glasgow book, a Glasgow case study. They were not interested at all. And so I found that really difficult, and I went around quite a lot of publishers to do that. And how I changed the book was it was the name of the book. I thought, well, it's just going to be about the working class perspective on gentrification. Just make it like a whole thing. Take Glasgow out the title, take all of that out the title, and that helped. In that, I'm not as savvy as many of my colleagues and peers when it comes to publishing. I'm sure that there'll be better conversations here. But one thing that I did do the second time round was sell the book as a pitch. It wasn't about the academic arguments and texts. It was about kind of provocations about class, and it just Routledge kind of snapped it up. But the intention was I was wanting it to be part of a series in Routledge called An Everyday Life. Does anyone remember those that series, Consumption in Everyday Life and other things like that, and they were paperbacks, and they were a different kind of style of book, but that series ended and people forgot that I was there. So it was just circumstances, and then they published the book that way. But I think, getting the temperature and navigating like publishers and what they're looking for, and trying to turn your book into something that's more palatable, I think, is something that can be learned. And I think talking to people that have done it will be really helpful in doing that. Is that everything?
I think so, and I'm sure if there's anything you haven't covered, people will tackle you in the hallways later on. Nicola, you want to come in?
Just on those points about kind of histories and archives, I just wanted to flag that we've got the Working Class Movement Library joining us this afternoon and joining us tomorrow in the voice session, the podcasting session. So this is an absolutely fantastic resource, a local resource here, open access resource on working class histories, that also does lots of great work on education around those working class movements as well. So I really encourage you to come along to those sessions, not just because I'm running one of them, because I think it's going to be great to listen to what they've got to share with us as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much to the audience for your generosity in engaging with the discussion, and thank you very much to our panellists for the rich discussion that got us. And if you don't all go off and buy the book, I'll be tackling you in the hallways. Okay, to lunch.
Thank you.